Space, as Douglas Adams said, is big. Really big. And honestly, I can't top that for an intro. So I'm just going to let Big do all the heavy lifting and tell you that space is very big. But if you're a world builder and you're building a science fantasy world, that vastness of space is something that you have to come to grips with. You have to figure out how you're going to map it, how you're going to introduce it to your reader or to your players. You have to figure out how your characters are going to navigate the vast expanse of very big space. And that is what I want to talk about today. Welcome to another episode from Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. Today, we're going to continue my series on space fantasy world building by talking about maps and space. If you like science fantasy and you'd like to support the channel, check out the book I co-wrote with my podcast partner Drake called Magic 4. It is a science fantasy novel set in a dystopian future with a flying city and two protagonists who have to eventually come together to save their city as resources run low and saboteurs wait in the wings. It also has a flying cat, so I mean, what's not to love? It has received some positive reviews, and we had a podcast where we discussed the whole arc of plotting Magic 4. So if you're interested in looking behind the scenes as to how one would plot such a novel and write such a novel, then you can check all of that out on the Magic 4 website down below. Okay, enough of that. Let's get cracking with maps and space. So for your mapping, you could of course use planets and asteroid belts and nebulas as a map. After all, Earth-bound species though we are, we can see planets and even other stars in the sky, right? And make maps of it. Well, I mean, sure. This kind of map making basically comes down to the simplest form of space mapping, and one we understand quite well. You decide what kind of object you're going to track, either planets or star systems or landmarks like nebulas or asteroid belts or the like, and you put them down with a distance measured between them. The verse from Firefly, for example, tracks planets this way. So does The Expanse from the TV series and the book. If you're not dealing with a myriad of star systems, this works really well. However, you're going to run into a crowding issue. One or two star systems and their planets, fine, sure, you can map the planets. More than that, the level of detail on the map is going to get absurd. If you're heading into the wild, dark yonder of multiple star systems and maybe even galaxies, you'd probably need to go from mapping planets and that level of detail to mapping stars. So in this kind of mapping system, the stars are treated as islands, some with their own clusters of planetary satellites. Much like how nations on Earth are defined by geographical landmarks, space borders can be established around the gravitational influence of the star. This makes the star system a cohesive geopolitical unit, easier for governance and control. Babylon 5 and Star Wars both map the galaxy in this way. From a world-building perspective, this kind of system creates fairly clear zones of influence and can be easier to plot on a galactic map. However, the sheer number of stars gets out of control in a hurry. If you think about our galaxy, such a map would be dense with points of interest, far too unwieldy to be useful to a storyteller. So, what to do if you're looking at such a scale, if you're looking galaxy-wide? Well, the simplest is to take a leaf from Star Trek in Warhammer 40k and divide space up into sectors or quadrants. Galaxies, vast as they are, can be divided into manageable chunks, like slicing a pie. These slices can be determined by simple location, or stellar density, or gravitational anomalies, or even the presence of certain megastructures like wormholes or Dyson spheres. For instance, Star Trek features the alpha, beta, and delta quadrants. According to StarTrek.com, if the great plane of the galaxy is viewed as a clock face, and the 6 o'clock position bisects the Sol system when viewed from the galactic North Pole, then the 4 fictional quadrants are as follows. Alpha quadrant is the quarter appearing between 6 and 9 o'clock. Beta quadrant is the quadrant appearing between 3 and 6 o'clock. Gamma quadrant is the quadrant appearing between 9 and 12 o'clock. And delta quadrant is the quadrant appearing between 12 and 3 o'clock. This kind of map making is very fair and even-handed in its way, and pretty much like Star Trek itself, strives to be in world building, a place of fairness and equality. But Warhammer 40k, the human empire, also uses sectoring, and they're anything but fair. So how does that kind of star map differ from Star Trek's quadrants? Well, to start with, Warhammer 40k is all about the military, right? So they split the galaxy into 5 segmentum, each with its own imperial navy and merchant fleets and naval base. The segmentums are pretty much independent of each other, and inside each segmentum there's sectors. The size of a sector varies, but are usually equivalent to a cube of 200 light years long. And this being Warhammer 40k, each sector has its battle fleet. Sectors are in turn divided into subsectors. Subsectors are centered on density of the population and around important worlds or the meeting points of warp trade routes. Now, in Warhammer 40k's case, the subsectors and sectors don't have to fill a segment. Indeed, the space between them is vast, unexplored, uninhabited, filled with aliens, or inaccessible by the warp. These zones are known by various names, including wilderness zones, forbidden zones, empty space, or frontier space. It should be clear that having that kind of wild area on your map is a great thing for a world builder. It gives you a place that you can send people to that they don't know what's there, and neither does the reader because it's unmapped. When you're building space fantasy, the majority of your space is probably going to be either roughly mapped or empty, because frankly, populating an entire galaxy would be complete overkill. So if you're going galaxy-wide, leave a lot of empty space. You will fill it up if you write long enough. By now, you should be able to see the pattern from our discussion on maps. Basically, star maps are Russian Matryoshka dolls. If you're working at a galactic level, use some sort of grouping of stars. If you're in a part of the galaxy, use the stars themselves. If you're working in a region with multiple inhabited planets and just a few stars, use the planets. That kind of Matryoshka doll situation lets you work up and down the level of detail scale as you need to in your map making exercise. Simple enough, right? Right. But a map isn't there just to give information of location. Indeed, a map can give you straight up incorrect information. For example, if you take a look at Africa on a flattened map, it looks like Africa is a large continent, but not that much larger than, say, Europe. This is false. If you compare the size, Africa can fit the United States, China, and most of Europe into its scale. It is a massive continent. But due to its location on the equator, it gets squashed by the flattening of the map. But surely in the far future where they are so much more enlightened, maps wouldn't lie to us like that, would they? Oh, my sweet summer child. Let's take a look at the Warhammer 40k map again. Besides the very militaristic setup of the segmentum versus the much more scientific setup of Star Trek, the other interesting thing about Warhammer 40k is that they somehow managed to put the solar system in the middle of the map, despite the fact that it obviously is not, because that's not where the sun is. So that is just lovely. It tells you so much about the Imperium in a single, eloquent picture. This kind of segmenting of galaxies can absolutely be political, and segments can be created in such a way as to favor more powerful star systems by including resource-rich areas of space into their segment, especially if the segments are geopolitical units and not just areas on a map. This is a topic we will dive into more deeply when we talk about governments and geopolitical units in space fantasy. But for now, just bear in mind that humans will find a way to make their maps tell you what they want those maps to tell you. Never mind the actual truth of where the stars are. And if you've enjoyed this discussion so far, hit that thumbs up button, and let's talk about turning left at the second star and heading straight till morning. One of the more complex matters that any world builder, or indeed astronaut, has to grapple with is the issues of distance and time in space. In the vast cosmos, these concepts become so much more fluid and at times elusive. When we think of distance on Earth, we often rely on familiar metrics like kilometers or miles. But in space, these units quickly become redundant. Enter the light year, which denotes the distance light travels in a single year, about 9.5 trillion kilometers or 5.9 trillion miles. But even such vast units of measure, space is so incomprehensibly big that even light years can sometimes feel inadequate. This being the case, you might want to mark that old light year up or down and give it some kind of, kilo light year. Or alternatively, map the way your faster than light travel works. Now, this is very dependent on how you break the travel barrier. Or if you do, for that matter, but I'm going to assume that you do for this video. Now, as far as I see it, there are a couple of ways to break the FTL barrier. 1. Engines. Engines can allow you access to some kind of FTL space. So Star Wars has the hyperdrive, Star Trek has the warp drive, Babylon 5 has hyperspace. 2. You can have some kind of wormhole tech, like Stargate's gates, or in Star Trek you have wormholes, or in Babylon 5 you have jump gates. 3. Humans and machines and magic navigation. So Warhammer 40k with the immaterium that the navigators take you through, or in Dune the navigators folding space to allow faster than light travel. I will go into detail on these various mechanics and what they mean for you as a world builder when I talk about technology and science fantasy. But for this episode, I want to talk about how the means of travel changes your map. In the Stargate universe, for example, you don't even need to worry about a star map per se. All you need is the portal address. The same applies to Babylon 5's jump gates. In Warhammer 40k and Dune, maps are less useful because it's the navigator who really needs to know where they're going, and they navigate by means other than maps. And that's why Warhammer 40k's maps don't really lie to you. From the perspective of the navigator in the warp, Earth is at the center of the universe. Because that's where the Astronomicon is. That is where the Emperor's brain shines his guiding light into the warp for his people to explore the galaxy with. So when you're creating your map of the universe, consider carefully how you're breaking the FTL barrier, if you are, and how that affects what people need from a map. Do they need to navigate via the map? Do they need warp routes mapped out to them? Or do they just need to figure out where the nearest portal is? The answer to that question will change how your map looks. Now, space and time are the same, and yet time gets very tricky in space. Time is not an absolute entity, but it is relative, as Einstein's theory of relativity has shown us. As objects move faster and approach the speed of light, time for them starts to slow down relative to objects that are stationary. This presents all kinds of complications, especially when you're thinking about communicating or coordinating between different points in space where time might not be flowing in the same way. And this is something that your maps might need to take note of. A brilliant illustration of this challenge is an episode in Babylon 5. The Narn ambassador is eager to conduct a religious ritual that needs to be performed at a specific moment in time based on the dawn of Narn's independence. Due to unforeseen circumstances, he misses this crucial moment. But, in a beautiful twist, Commander Sinclair offers a solution. Why not perform the ritual when the light from Narn's star, which first shone on the dawn of the planet's independence, reaches Babylon 5 station? It's a touching solution that brings home the intricacies of time in space. This light, which was emitted years ago from Narn, carries with it the historical and emotional significance of that moment when it first shone from the star. Time in space isn't just about the ticking of a clock. It can also be about movement and the history of light. Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game series also explores the relativity of time and travel. As ships move faster, nearing the speed of light, those on board age much more slowly than those left behind on planets. This results in characters who, while only a few years older in their experience, return to civilizations that have progressed by decades or even centuries. It adds layers of complexity to interpersonal dynamics, politics, and societal progression. As a world builder, you have a plethora of tools at your disposal when crafting your narrative around time and distance in space. Whether you're creating heart-wrenching scenarios of loved ones aging at different rates due to space travel, or whether you're enacting clever solutions like Sinclair's, the elasticity of time and the vastness of distance in space can be both a challenge and a treasure trove for storytelling. And if you're enjoying this video so far, consider giving it a super thanks. And let's talk about three-dimensional nature of space. When we think of maps on Earth, we generally imagine two-dimensional representations of three-dimensional landscapes, with maybe some contour lines, shading, or some kind of 3D effects to imply elevation. But space operates in all directions, making our usual methods of representation fall short. Here are some ways to navigate this challenge. You can have layered or stacked maps. Think of this like the floors of a building where each floor represents a slice of space. By navigating between these layers, you can get a sense of depth. This is particularly useful in regions where there's a lot of vertical activity, like around a dense cluster of stars or perhaps in a nebula. You could also, in your world, introduce holography. A popular representation in sci-fi, holographic maps can display a three-dimensional region of space in its entirety, allowing for rotation, zoom, and exploration. With advancements in technology, we're getting closer to realizing such displays on Earth in our own time, which would be beneficial for us understanding space's depth and volume. So certainly in a science fantasy world, you could introduce such technology. You could also use a grid system with coordinates of X, Y, and Z, where you actually have your Z axis and you have a 3D graph style map. Of course, you can also simplify your map by just focusing on points of interest. Not all regions of space need to be detailed with a map. Remember what I said about leaving a lot of wild space. By focusing on areas of interest and by mapping only their immediate vicinities in 3D, you can simplify large stretches of space that might be empty or unimportant to your narrative. And of course, like our contour lines, you can have some kind of visual indicators for depths. So simple visual cues like color gradients, size scaling, or shadowing can imply depth. For example, stars might be shown to be larger and brighter the closer they are, and dimmer and smaller the further away they are. And of course, bear in mind that how your reader consumes the map doesn't have to be how your characters consume the map. Characters can have all kinds of cool gadgets like a holographic display that lets them map where they are, and you can show that to the reader without it being a picture. The reader's front of book map might just have to be a 2D artist's rendition, and your reader will probably like that just fine. Next time, we'll plunge into technology building in science fantasy, and we will take a look at things like space travel, weapons, and how to build technology that fits with your world. And those are my thoughts on mapping space, that very big area. If you liked this video, consider giving it a super thanks or becoming a channel member for these cool perks. But another way you can help the channel is by clicking on my video on creating weird worlds, which is on screen now. Watching 2 videos in a row on my channel helps the algorithm know that my channel is loved and helps the channel grow. So please, clicky.